So now that Borderlands 4 has been fully revealed, it's got me thinking about how long this franchise has existed and how many different systems have been in all of the different entries. So in this video, I want to go over the 5 things I would want in the next Borderlands game. Now, with Borderlands 4 seemingly being pretty close to release, if any of these things aren't currently in Borderlands 4, they're not going to be in the game for launch. But if we go off of the post-launch support that Borderlands 3 received, we could very easily see a lot of pretty massive updates and changes to the game as a whole. So a lot of these are just things I would want in my perfect Borderlands game. And at number 5, we have raid bosses, things like Terramorphous or Cromarax. Those one-shot bosses that you go into a boss arena, it's a super difficult boss, and if you end up being able to defeat it, it gives you a massive amount of loot. A lot of them having some amount of a buy-in cost, so some amount of currency you have to use to be able to go actually fight against that boss. And the reason I'm putting this in the list is because in Borderlands 3, it took a long time to get our first raid boss. Now, it wasn't super long after release of the game until we got our first takedown that technically had a raid boss in it, but in my opinion, that's something completely different. When I'm talking about these raid bosses, I'm talking about them being a one boss in one arena that you go into and you just face the boss and whatever other adds it'll spawn during that fight, and not something that's more akin to a raid like what we got with takedowns. And I know there may be some differing opinions on having a cost to go against these raid bosses, but I think that's actually something that there should be with all of the raid bosses, or at least most of them, have some amount of cost to go into that fight, because that also allows the developers to make that fight much more rewarding. When I go and defeat a super difficult raid boss, I want there to just be a ridiculous amount of loot spewing from out of that boss. And having a payment to get into that fight definitely allows a lot more loot to it. And I just think these one-shot raid bosses in Borderlands games is just a really important part, and it's something that pretty much everybody has fond memories of, or is at least something that people have pretty strong memories of. I know a lot of people probably remember their first time going against Cromarax, and then their first time finally being able to defeat that massive crab. And then at number 4, we have something kind of similar to raid bosses in takedowns, and these were basically raids in Borderlands 3. And we got 2 of them over its lifespan. We got takedown at the Maliwan Black site, and we got takedown at the Guardian Breach. Now, takedown at the Guardian Breach, I think, was not a very good takedown or raid. I know a lot of people didn't like it. I didn't like a lot of the mechanics they had in there either, but I thought takedown at Maliwan Black site was incredibly good and unique content for the Borderlands franchise. As I mentioned, these were basically raids coming into Borderlands. So I do think there was a lot more they could do with these, and there's a lot more they could do with actually making raid style content. But something like takedown at the Maliwan Black site was a very good first attempt. The content itself was really good, and it was pretty difficult and interesting and fun content, whether you were doing it solo or with a group. You had multiple bosses throughout the run. You had massive amounts of enemies. It's one thing that I think a lot of the community of Borderlands doesn't give enough credit to some parts of the franchise, is just the mob density. And Maliwan Black site had ridiculous amounts of enemies to fight at once. It was very overwhelming. And then the bosses were also really interesting. So this content as a whole was just super good. And I not only want them to bring back takedowns for Borderlands 4, but I want them to keep expanding on a raid style system for Borderlands as a whole. I think raids are heavily underutilized in the Borderlands franchise, takedowns basically being the only ones. And when you go and look at other RPGs, and when you go and look at even other looter shooters like Destiny, they have incredibly good raids. Then you go and look at other things like other MMOs, they have incredibly good raids, and that's usually a really big part of MMOs. And I think that's very much something that Borderlands could have a bigger focus on. And then at number 3, we have item crafting. crafting. And this is a bit more of an experimental opinion, or something that hasn't been done a ton in the Borderlands franchise. We've had a little bit of it. In the pre-sequel, you have the grinder where you can put in 3 different weapons and get a random weapon out, and you can kind of determine what weapon you're going to get based on the rarity or other factors. Then in, say, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, you had the enchantment reroller where you would use a resource to reroll the enchantment on items. I think Borderlands 3 later in its life also got a similar system for anointments, but more specifically what I'm talking about is being able to augment your gear in different ways. I'm not actually talking about just crafting like a whole new item from something. I'm talking about getting an item in the game, then using resources on it to change up its stats, maybe be able to change up parts on it, maybe add new effects to it, or augment the effects that are actually on it. And this is obviously very inspired from the subgenre of Diablo-like RPGs, where after you get an item, you can then do a handful of different things to it. And I would say probably take more inspiration from something like Diablo 4, because I think it's simple enough to work well in a Borderlands game, but still has enough depth to make it really interesting. Obviously, something like Path of Exile 1's crafting system wouldn't work in a game like Borderlands. It's just way too much. It's way too intricate. There's way too many resources. But just having maybe a couple resources with a couple different possibilities of crafting items you already have, I think would add a massive amount of longevity to the game in general for build crafting and just changing up your playstyle or your stats, and would also allow you to more use the weapons that you really like to use. And I think that's actually a big issue not talked about enough in Borderlands, where they have all of these super unique and really cool weapons that have all these different functions and different things that they do, but then these weapons, just because of balancing in the meta, won't end up being super strong. But if you had more ways to craft on items in Borderlands, you could take that weapon you really like and maybe make something that is as strong as some of the other much more meta weapons. So a weapon you really like, you could continue using and make it much stronger. And I just think, as this is a very heavily loot-focused RPG, not having very much crafting systems has always been a missed opportunity for the franchise as a whole. And at number 2, I have more expansive skill trees. Now, in one of my recent videos, I went over all the possibilities with skill trees for Borderlands 4, and I also went over that in the Borderlands franchise and all of the mainline games, the skill trees have gotten bigger throughout every single game. Going from Borderlands 1 to 2 to the pre-sequel to Borderlands 3, the skill trees have gotten bigger in every single one of those games, which just allows you a lot more options. It allows for a lot more variation, and it just allows for a lot more build crafting. Even specifically going into Borderlands 3, you got a lot more options because you had the different active skills you could choose, you had different augments for those skills, and all of just your passive choices in the trees itself. You had a lot more options of those as well. So I'm hoping they continue this going into Borderlands 4. I'm someone that likes expansive, really interesting skill trees, and I think just having a lot more options for those skill trees and just allowing you to make much more interesting builds is just going to be a positive for Borderlands 4, and just going to be a positive for the replayability and how long people continue to play this game, which also just means people are going to be playing the game more to keep buying every new DLC that comes out. So I just think having more expansive and interesting skill trees is just going to be really positive for the franchise as a whole. And as a side note, I do think they could make a lot more interesting options with the skill trees. Now, they probably wouldn't be able to go super crazy with this, but the first thing I always think of is going to any RPGs or ARPGs more specifically that allow you to have like multicast or additional projectiles on abilities. Even more specifically, going into Path of Exile 2 that's just released, I was using a build that allowed me to just have a ton of additional projectiles on fireballs. And if I got specific procs, I was able to just fire dozens of fireballs at a time that when they hit anything, either a wall or an enemy, would then also break into like dozens of additional firebolts. And things like that just make RPGs and loot-driven games super interesting. And I know in Borderlands, you can't do that as much because it is an FPS, but I think going more into unique and interesting effects would just be super fun. And then finally, at my number 1 spot, we have more item rarities. Now, my last video, I went over this. I went over a bunch of information on what I think they could add as more rarities to Borderlands 4. But to be very simple, I very much hope we have the normal rarities that we got in Borderlands 3 and Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, which is common, uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary. But then I hope on launch, we get at least one more rarity, obviously being pearlescent, being basically that next step up above legendaries, still similar to legendaries, but super rare and a bit of a step up. Even just having a next rarity up that's super rare and just getting that drop, getting that different colored beam with that new color of item is just super fun to go and be able to go farm. But you could also have other things like the glitch rarity from the pre-sequel, which is one of the most unique rarities in any loot-driven game. And then you could also have a slew of other ones that they've used throughout the franchise as a whole. But all in all, I very much hope we are getting at least one additional rarity on launch of Borderlands 4. And I also hope that they continue to add more over its lifespan. Not necessarily adding one new rarity for every DLC like Borderlands 2 did, but adding a new rarity here and there is always an incredibly exciting thing for new content releases. But those are the 5 most important things I want in a new Borderlands game, and I hope a handful of these are going to be in Borderlands 4 on launch. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.